Hi, my name is Alexis Gonzalez, and I will be doing the moral ethics in voluntary euthanasia. In the overview, we can make a clear outline in further analyzing euthanasia and what I will be going over in this presentation. First, I will be going over the objective, and then I will go over the basics and background of euthanasia, which include passive, active, types of euthanasia, physician-assisted suicide, voluntary, non-voluntary, and involuntary euthanasia. I will also go over understanding moral theories and how 4 of them can be applied to euthanasia. Utilitarianism, Kant's ethics, natural law theory, and virtual ethics will be included in this. And then the heart of this presentation, which is the news story, the moral argument, the opposition, the evaluation of that moral argument, and whether it is sound or unsound. For the objective of this presentation, we will want to analyze euthanasia and how it affects our fundamental right of choosing how we live our life. By the end of this presentation, I hope you can create your own stance on voluntary active euthanasia and decide whether or not the moral argument does or does not correlate with it. Essentially, euthanasia is a mercy killing, but can be defined in many different ways, its most primary being to take direct or indirect actions to bring about the death of another person and believing that the individual would be better off dead. This can include immense suffering, being incapacitated, and so on. Euthanasia is also made up of principal components that include passive and active, and can be further broken down into different types. As depicted on the images on the right, you can see that this further forms the picture of euthanasia and how controversial it can be, especially the graph that shows how much people can change their mind from being supportive to doing the exact opposite. Passive euthanasia is one of the vital components of euthanasia. It is not, or refraining from, doing an action. Passive euthanasia is the type of euthanasia where the death is brought about by omitting the means necessary for the patient to live. It is generally accepted morally, and like it is depicted in the picture, can be when you turn off a machine to let them naturally die out. Active euthanasia is quite self-explanatory, especially in its name. Like it says, it's doing or taking action about something. Active euthanasia entails taking direct action to end an individual's life, which can include physician-assisted suicide. This particular principle of euthanasia is hotly debated, as it actually requires the killing of someone as opposed to just letting it happen naturally, like passive euthanasia. It's not as accepted morally, but it still happens in today's world. As mentioned earlier, euthanasia can be broken down even further into different types. This can include voluntary euthanasia, non-voluntary euthanasia, and involuntary euthanasia. Physician-assisted suicide goes hand in hand with these, as it is the occurrence of when a physician facilitates a patient's death by providing the necessary means to do so. It is also often said that it is a big societal risk for the physician as it goes against their role as a healer. As you can see in the lower part of the slide, there is a graph which I feel is relevant to this physician-assisted suicide, as it shows how it continues to affect society today. According to Lancet.com, assisted deaths continue to rise substantially in Belgium and the Netherlands, with assisted suicide constituting 3 to 5% of assisted deaths in the Netherlands in 2016. The frequency of assisted deaths in Oregon is increasing at a much more reduced rate than in the Netherlands and is currently at less than 10% of Dutch numbers. The rate of increase in assisted suicides in Switzerland, where this practice is tolerated without legal safeguards or monitoring, is similar to the rate of increase in Belgium and the Netherlands, with a frequency that is approaching that of Belgium. To continue on with our topic, voluntary euthanasia is a type of euthanasia in which a patient is competent enough to make their own decision and agrees to be euthanized. The patient and/or individual can request to make a living will or instructions in the event that they may or may not become incapacitated. I put this particular picture because there's hands raising up, representing that someone is volunteering. Non-voluntary euthanasia is an instance in euthanasia where the individual is incapacitated and others, such as family or physicians, can make the decision of whether or not they will be euthanized or want to be euthanized. I put a picture of a physician holding this lady's hand because it is showing how she is not able to make that decision for herself any longer. Involuntary euthanasia is the most morally impermissible, and illegal. It is an occasion when a patient is competent enough to make decisions but is euthanized against their request or consent anyway. In this picture, the old man is sleeping, so you can tell he doesn't really know what's happening, and I put a stop sign, to show that it's wrong. Now we shift on to the next topic where we start applying moral theories to euthanasia. First, I will just describe a brief, basic understanding of what each moral theory is, and then we will get into how it applies to euthanasia. So first we have utilitarianism, which does not necessarily center around what is morally wrong or right, but rather how heavily the consequences will weigh based on certain decisions or outcomes. Next, there is Kant's ethics, which is based on the famous philosopher Immanuel Kant, and it is based mostly on the belief that all humans have intrinsic value and should never be treated as a means to an end or mere disposable things. And we will get into how euthanasia does or does not do that. Then we have the natural law theory, which is the doctrine that we as individuals have a moral obligation or duty to preserve life. So whatever we can, if we ever see a situation where somebody's in need of help, our duty as people, according to this doctrine, is to help them regardless, even if we have to go out of our way to do so. Lastly, we have virtue ethics, which was designed by another famous philosopher, Aristotle, and it's a theory formed by him that is centered around ways to achieve excellent virtue and just to be an excellent human overall, instead of action-based goals. So this is heavily based on character and things like compassion, kindness, and so on. Now that we have a basic understanding of what these theories are, we can apply them to euthanasia. In regards to the utilitarian views, the act utilitarian could argue based on the state of the patient and observe which outcome would lead to the highest happiness for everyone. So for example, if that patient's situation were hopeless and his suffering was just really great, then the overall happiness would be from him dying, because now his loved ones don't have to see him, suffering, and now he doesn't have to feel the suffering anymore. In contrast, a rule utilitarian could say that active voluntary euthanasia would only cause more harm overall, because it not only violates the medical code, but could possibly lead to innocent killing if abused. So, with active euthanasia, we know that the healer's code is more being violated because you're actually killing someone. But the rule utilitarians are saying that if they do this, that it will basically tell other people that it's okay to kill because of this active voluntary euthanasia. One thing both sides have in common is that they can agree in concluding that euthanasia would only be morally permissible in the instance when the death of that person would be both to ease their suffering and the most beneficial for all the parties involved. With the moral theory of Kant's ethics, almost all scenarios come to the conclusion that euthanasia is really permissible because they treat humans as though they are a means to an end, which is the exact opposite of what they achieve to do. Kant argues that suicide is wrong because not only are you treating yourself as a means to an end, but you lose your personhood, which, in essence, your principal values of ethics as well. You regress almost to that of what Kant says as animals are. This is with no exception, however, to the people who are in vegetative states, because they would no longer be considered people, as they are incapacitated. Kant's ethics could most likely even support this. Similar to Kant's ethics, the natural law theory also states that euthanasia is wrong in almost every instance. However, this is also an exception to the double doctrine effect. The double doctrine effect is the distinction between good actions that have a bad effect and bad actions that reap good results. This doctrine basically implies that if you have a suffering patient and give them a large dose of morphine to end their life, that is never morally permissible. But if you give them a large dose of morphine with the intention of easing their pain, and that action happens to have the side effect of her death, it is. The last moral theory that can be applied to euthanasia is virtue ethics. I will not be going as into much detail as the other ones because there is not much to say, solely because this particular theory is based on character, but I will explain how it could affect a physician. So, if the physician was virtuous, this theory would support this and further prove that easing their pain would be the right response. Because the physician is virtuous, they can now understand the degree of her pain, making it okay to perform euthanasia in this instance because it will grant the release from it. We now get to the most important part of the presentation, where we make a moral argument on a specific euthanasia case and decide if it is sound or not. In this recent news article, it is centered around 3 doctors in Belgium who were acquitted in a euthanasia case. It is commonly known that the use of euthanasia had become legal in Belgium since 2002. Still, these doctors had been accused of manslaughter and were facing life imprisonment for unlawfully poisoning a 38-year-old woman in 2010. Because the patient had been diagnosed with several psychiatric problems early on, her sisters argued that she wasn't treated before and therefore should not have been euthanized. However, according to the news article, both the doctors and physician who gave the lethal dose were released after a 2-week-long trial period. The moral argument that can be formed from this particular case is as follows. 1. Capable individuals have the right to determine what they choose to do with their lives. 2. This natural right is in conjunction with the manner in which they die and whether or not they decide to participate in active euthanasia. 3. As people, we have a duty/obligation to help others when in need, including euthanasia's performance to ease the pain of incompetent individuals who have lost the essence of that natural right. 4. 3 doctors in Belgium had the opportunity to help a person who was no longer considered capable. 5. Those 3 doctors had an obligation to fill the essence of that right. 6. Therefore, those 3 doctors had the right to perform euthanasia on that particular individual. The opposition to this particular argument can be formatted throughout the textbook and goes as follows. 1. If the general acceptance or approval of active voluntary euthanasia leads to widespread abuse, unjustified killing, then the practice is morally wrong. 2. The general acceptance of approval of active voluntary euthanasia will lead to widespread abuses, unjustified killing. 3. Therefore, active voluntary euthanasia is wrong. Now we will actually evaluate the moral case and see if the premises and conclusions are true. In the argument of the opposition, premise 2 lacks substantial evidence because its general acceptance of voluntary euthanasia is not completely definite in its social consequences. This makes the whole argument untrue. Furthermore, the textbook states a similar possible slippery slope worry could have been raised to securing competent patients' rights to decide about life support, but recent history shows such a worry would have been unfounded. In the moral argument created about the news story, premise 1 contains essential ethical rights that are approved by all controversial areas of euthanasia. However, premises 2 and 3 are debatable because self-determination does not always imply the use of euthanasia, as it is still considered killing. There are also possible arguments that there is really no need for euthanasia because medicine is advanced enough to where the patient won't feel any pain. Some even say that euthanasia would only do more harm than good by depriving them of the joys that come with life. In evaluating and reading the moral arguments in opposition, how will we truly know if this is sound or unsound? This slide answers that, both the research and the information on this slide. Though it is true that euthanasia is killing, there are still cases where the killing is justifiable. This includes both war and self-defense. Even if it is possible to stop all physical pain, side effects of medication could possibly worsen the mental condition of the patient and in turn prolong their suffering and make it untreatable. This makes all premises and conclusions sound and true. These are my sources, and thank you. Have a great day.